Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen and you're listening to episode 44. Today's guest is Adeel Hussain, who is the author of a brilliant book called Revenge, Politics and Blasphemy in Pakistan. Together we're going to take a deep dive into the history of blasphemy in South Asia, but specifically in Pakistan. We trace the history of blasphemy from colonial India to present times and look at how big of a role blasphemy plays in today's politics, in society, and within the legal frameworks. It's such an eye-opening book. I highly recommend it. Also, podcasting is rough. It takes a lot of time and energy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. But if you're enjoying it and you want to support, then do consider being a patron. Just visit brownhistorypodcast.com. And it's a very simple process. Your contribution goes a long way. Trust me on that. And thank you so much for listening. And let's move forward. Here we go. This is such a brilliant book. I really enjoyed reading it. I read it in 2 days and my brain is still processing it, but there is so much going on in the book. It's well written and it takes your understanding of Pakistan to the next level, which, really helps me a lot because Pakistani politics is very complicated. For me, it was really hard to figure out how to start this because there's so many ways we can start this, but I figured maybe it's best if you just give us an intro of what the book is about. And the title of the book is Revenge, Politics, and Blasphemy in Pakistan. And I think everybody understands what blasphemy means, but could you define it in the context of Pakistan? Because we all know that, Pakistan is very sensitive when it comes to saying something negative about Islam, and that's putting it lightly.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Asun. And let's just jump straight into the book. So essentially, maybe it's going to help for the listeners if I just give like a brief intro of how I came to writing this book. So I wanted to understand something that was very simple in essence, and that is why in Pakistan, a lot of the big constitutional controversies that we've seen over the last 70 years have circled around the idea of blasphemy. So whereas in other countries, when we look at what people are debating over, it's issues that have to do with social justice, it's issues that have to do with equality, but it's not necessarily issues that have a specific theological underpinning. And in order to understand that theological underpinning, I tried to decipher the backstory of blasphemy in Pakistan. And to figure out the backstory in Pakistan, I had to go back all the way into the colonial history of India and find what I consider to be like the first debate that happened between Muslims and non-Muslims regarding blasphemy, and that culminated into this sort of vigilante killings that have become very widespread and widely accepted in large parts of the populations in the Indian subcontinent, so both in India, as we've tragically seen in recent events, and in Pakistan. So I really came to this question trying to understand the sort of legal matrix of Pakistan, and then went all the way back and tried to figure out what the backstory of those blasphemy killings were. And in terms of structure, the book is like kind of very is structured in a very straightforward manner. So it begins with a specific murder, and it tries to it tries to disentangle the sort of social and political and legal impact that those killings had.
So you said that it all started with a Hindu-Muslim conflict or an argument, a dispute. Can we go back to the start and where the seeds started to show?
So maybe just to outline the kind of conventional views that have been floating around regarding Hindu-Muslim conflict. So when you open up a textbook in India or Pakistan, there's multiple ways in which we can approach this historical issue. In Pakistani textbooks, we would see that there's a type of separate Muslim identity that has existed for thousands of years, and it always was in some type of antagonistic conflict with Hinduism, and eventually Indian Muslims liberated themselves from that majoritarian Hindu influence and created their own nation state. On the other hand, there's a view that no, it's always been more syncretic, so Hindus and Muslims have lived like peacefully together, and essentially what we saw happen in 1947 with partition was a kind of misunderstanding, right? So it was political leaders who were fed up of trying to go through the sort of very thorny constitutional negotiations around the roundtable conferences, and later on with the cabinet mission plan, and then decided to sort of break up and create two separate nation states, the state of India and the state of Pakistan. So both of these schools would see the emergence of blasphemy as a touchstone for identity formation differently. So say the primordialist kind of view on this issue would say that, well, Muslims have always been very sensitive regarding insults against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there's some truth to that. So insults against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, have always stirred up some type of reaction. But the very specific reactions that we see in the subcontinent, especially in the late colonial era, where people are seeing it as a kind of moral imperative to go out and commit that type of violence, is something that we don't really see in all Muslim societies around the globe. And it's certainly not something that we have seen in many other centuries within the Indian subcontinent. So when we look at other sort of controversy that circled around the issue of blasphemy, then say the Barelvi-Deobandi divide in the 19th century comes to mind. So the Barelvi-Deobandi divide was really about the Barelvis who constitute like the majority in the subcontinent.
Before you continue, can you just explain the terms so people know what you're talking about?
Yeah, so Barelvis trace their doctrinal sort of origin through a specific devotional love to the Prophet Muhammad. So when we look at like specific Sufi orders, they would be closer to the Barelvi school than they would be to a sort of specific rationalistic modernist version of understanding religion that in India showed itself in the garb of Deobandi Islam. So Deobandis were this sort of kind of more rationally, textually minded scholars who took their inspiration, even though there's a little bit of dispute of that, from the sort of Wahhabi revivalism that we also saw in the Arabian Peninsula. So it was a specific textualist tradition that tried to rid Islam of anything cultural, of anything that was an addition, they believed, to the basic original tenets of Islam. Okay. And the key sort of blasphemy dispute that emerged between these groups were the Barelvis accusing the Deobandis of committing blasphemy by not giving the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam the right, by not showing deference enough to the Prophet, but by considering him a mere human who had, of course, a specific prophetic mission, but who could not transcend that very mission. Whereas in the Barelvi theological doctrine, the Prophet has powers that would make him stand quite apart from a regular sort of human, right? So they have a specific notion that he can be present anywhere at any given time. And illuminate spiritually the people who devote their lives to him. And the Barelvis felt that the Bandis, with their sort of very rationalistic approach of saying that, well, he was in essence mere human, they felt that that was an attack on the role that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has played in history and still continues to play. But those controversies never ended in violence, let alone large-scale violence, and they never really stirred up a large group of people to the same extent that we see blasphemy accusations stir up entire groups of people in the late 19th century. So when we want to look what my contribution to this debate really is that instead of looking at an intra-Muslim conversation regarding the role and status of the Prophet, peace be upon him, it may be more fruitful to look at religious revivalist groups that were emerging in the Punjab in the 1900s. And those revivalist groups, or the two that I identified, which I believe to have set out many of the key terms in the blasphemy debate that we're still talking about, is the Hindu revivalist movement called Arya Samaj, and a group that has now been termed non-Muslim, but at the time was still acceptable, the Ahmadiyya of Qadian.
So, for people who don't know, what differs the Ahmadi sect from the other Muslim sects, and at the same time, I think a lot of people are familiar that right now in the current state, the Ahmadi sect is very marginalized, oppressed, and don't really have a say in things in Pakistani politics and society. But what was it for Ahmadis at that time, and how? Because I was surprised to read that they were pretty influential at that time and accepted, I think. So I want to know what their position was in society and politics, and I wanted to know, and I guess for the people who are listening, what makes an Ahmadi Muslim, and what was the dispute about between them and this other Hindu sect?
The basic novelty about Ahmadis is that they believe that their founder, a man called Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, that he was sent in order to reform the Muslim faith. And because he was on the mission to reform the Muslim faith, he was in direct communication with God. And this communication led him to claim certain things that are somewhat controversial within Muslim theology. One of the things was that he claimed that he was in direct communication with God and he was receiving revelation. That was a very straightforward thing that some people raised their eyebrows over. The other thing was that he successively claimed that he had a prophetic status. He initially began by saying that he was Mahdi, so a prophesized reformer that was to come to sort of bring the faith forward. Later on, he strengthened this claim and said that he was also Messiah, which means that he had come as the rebirth of Jesus and also as the rebirth of Krishna, the Hindu prophet. And that, of course, as you can imagine, stirred up quite some controversy even at the time. So it wasn't that the Ahmadis, even in their inception, were widely accepted, but they were accepted within a specific, for a specific task, because they were accomplishing a specific task. And the task was that in North India and Punjab, where there was a new middle class forming, we're thinking now about the turn of the century, so the turn of the 20th century. So a new group of merchants is settling down, a middle class is emerging, a salariat, as one would say today, is emerging. And the Ahmadis were very successful in converting these urban professionals to their faith by instilling a new sense of religious pride into them. And they instilled this religious pride by engaging in controversial debates with other religious groups. So I think it's best to sort of think about it as a way in which different groups at the time saw a specific moment in history where they could convert people again. In the sense that a lot of Muslims tried to convert Hindus to Islam and a lot of Hindus tried to convert Muslims to Hinduism. And in that debate, the people who were very influential were these revivalist movements, because those were the ones who were at the forefront of these conversion efforts. And the Ahmadis were accepted in the framework that they were trying to hold Muslims of North India, especially of Punjab, to convert to Christianity and to Hinduism. And at the same time, they were going and having debates with other revivalist sects. And they were having these debates mainly because the Muslim ulama in the seats of learning, say the people who were in Farangi Mahal and Deoband and all the other places where we had Muslim seminaries, were not willing to engage in open discussions with, say, the Arya Samaj and, people like Dayanand Saraswati. Or somebody like Pandit Lekram, who features prominently in the book. So here we have a group that was partially accepted as like an organ that could defend the frontiers of faith. But at the same time, there was a lot of doubt over their own status within the Muslim community. And pretty much when Mirza Ghulam Ahmad made his claims, there were people and ulama who were denouncing him and his claim and saying that he had become a Ghafir for transcending the boundaries of religious faith.
How does blasphemy play into how does his role come into blasphemy?
Yeah, so what I show in the book is that blasphemy was kind of like the key tool that he used in order to engage in theological debate with other faiths. So whereas we had inter-religious discourse for hundreds of years on the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal conqueror Akbar usually comes to mind, who had a court which had groups of different religious clerics who were speaking to each other quite on a regular basis and very intensely. I do feel what really changed was that for Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the key thing became about spectacles. So this was not a scholarly debate that we would assume coming out of the confines of Farangi Mahal or Deoband, but this was really in a way, a bombastic exchange that would often lead to immediate, what he called revelations about people dying. So I think it's best to picture it like this. So here's two scholars that would meet. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad would be there, representing the sides of the Muslims, and then you would have somebody representing the Arya Samaj. Very often that was a Dayanand Saraswati or Lekram or somebody else. And while having this debate, they would higher the stakes. And eventually, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad would say that the other person had committed blasphemy and would die within like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It really depends on the debate. But blasphemy really became a tool in order to convince people of the truth of his movement. And that is really, I feel, how blasphemy entered into the wider conversation in colonial India.
Just to clarify, he didn't himself kill anybody, right?
No, it's a prophecy. So he would say that the other person would die and that God had prophesied that to him. And in the case of Lekram, which is like the first chapter of my book, I track that one conversation and how it sort of unfolded.
If I think of blasphemy, I think of violence. How did blasphemy and violence start to kind of become one thing in this context, in this dispute?
I mean, it's a very heavy question, and that's really the question that I try to address with the book. I do believe that the link between blasphemy and violence happened when the conceptual category that we had for how to react to blasphemy changed from having it as something that will be dealt with in the hereafter. So we commit, or somebody commits a specific act of blasphemy, and then he is punished by God in the hereafter. That was like a very mainstream kind of belief. Two, that somebody commits blasphemy and it becomes an individual sort of moral responsibility of the Muslim believer to avenge that blasphemy. So that wasn't there in the early part of the 19th century, but towards the mid-20th century, it seems to be that even within a fringe, it's become fairly mainstream, that it's an individual moral responsibility on the believer to avenge acts of blasphemy. And we see that really as being at the crux of the big the big issue that we really see unfolding in Pakistan, where we constantly have acts of vigilante killings that don't really stop with non-Muslims anymore, but even politicians have been assassinated. And then the aftermath of these events is really this odd interplay where the state is seeking to punish the person who has committed that act, but at the same time also tries to uphold this specific, what they feel is a scriptural authority on how to prosecute blasphemy.
So just to summarize, before the independence of Pakistan and India, in the Indian subcontinent, you would have debates between Hindu sects and Muslim sects, and they would get really ugly and really nasty. And people listening in, reading the pamphlets that were passed around, they would take that as an insult, and a Muslim would end up killing or assassinating one of the a leader of that Muslim sect, and then it would be then another Muslim, then another Hindu member would take over, and then it would continue the cycle. Okay, so that was the cycle, right, where you had two sects disputing with each other, and then people would get offended, and one of them would kill the leader of the Hindu sect. How did that go from that to putting blasphemy in the legal framework of society of the Indian subcontinent? And by the way, what were the British up to while this was all happening?
The British were up to no good, as you probably know. But essentially, so essentially, and that's the story that I track in my book, is that a lot of the members that were involved with these two revivalist movements became very influential in mobilizing politically. So they were very influential. Members of the Arya Samaj became very influential through people like Swami Shraddhanand in the newly founded All India Congress Party. For those who don't know, the All India Congress Party was really the big anti-colonial movement that produced the second biggest decolonial moment after Britain lost America. So here we have this big movement, and the movement is mainly relying upon professionals, a lot of lawyers. These lawyers are both from the region of Bengal, but many of them are from the Punjab, and in the Punjab, many of them have direct links to the Arya Samaj movement. So somebody like Lala Lajpat Rai, so these are really the greats of the Congress party. Somebody like Swami Shraddhanand are outright Arya Samajis, which means that they've devoted quite a bit of their time to teach in the seminaries, and they believe in the basic message of Hindu revivalism. And they are part of this kind of big project of decolonization. And on the other hand, within the Muslim nationalist movement, we have a lot of people in the initial formation who are close to the Ahmadiyya group. And that makes it, I believe, that helped in order to bring those early debates. There were very much provincial debates that were taking place with a couple of thousand people following them, that really brought them to national attention. And later on, and I would think here in the 1930s and 40s, it became a tool for political mobilization. It became very clear that when the Muslim League needed to bring people to the streets, that that the specific language that was developed in the Arya Samaj Ahmadiyya conversation proved very useful for motivating young men to take to the streets.
So it was like the way Americans would blame immigrants, and if American politicians want votes and to get things done, they'd use immigrants as a way to kind of get people riled up, just the same way.
Yes, and which is not to say, not to downplay the problem, not to downplay that there was really a problem in which the Hindu majority within the Congress party tried to really bully Muslims through different means. And one of the means was to write disparagingly about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So I'm not taking that away. I'm just saying that it was also used as a sort of political tool for mobilization.
So all these disputes, this tension, is that what played a big role in the violence of partition? Because this was all taking place in Punjab.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things that really go into the violence that we see unfold in the Punjab during partition. I do feel that there is, like, the broadest way to approach it is to say that it was an administrative failure, in the sense that the executive at that point, for the most parts, that was Mountbatten as the viceroy, refused to deploy any troops in order to quell the early violence that had sort of unfolded. So the massive killings can't really, I feel, be brought down to any specific mindset that you could find within a population, but it was just a specific frenzy that at that stage in history we hadn't really seen unfold anywhere else. But it also happened in a vacuum where the executive had completely withdrawn, and there was hardly any military presence or hardly any attempt to sort of quell the violence that was unfolding. The second thing was, it was happening after the Second World War. It's an aspect that people generally underestimate, but a large part of the war, the Second World War, that Britain fought was also through the help of the Indian Army. And the British Indian Army consisted mainly of people from North India. Now, the reasons for that are a bit obscure, but the British believed in the martial race theory, and they believed that the races of the North were kind of better suited for military service. So they recruited them to an higher extent. And then we had an entire generation of young men who were coming back armed and who had just seen the devastating atrocities of the Second World War. And they were armed and thrown into this anarchic moment of 47. And yeah.
Okay, so let's say, okay, so now it's 1947 and Pakistan is a brand new, fresh country. It's a Muslim majority country now. So it's what they wanted. And blasphemy, there's no one to really use blasphemy against because it's majority Muslim. If blasphemy is the main character of the story, what happens to blasphemy now? What changes come, and how does blasphemy evolve, or does it go away?
So blasphemy doesn't really go away. So in the 47 moment, we have to sort of think about a greater Pakistan than we know today. We have two wings of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan.
Right.
And we have quite a big population of non-Muslims in East Pakistan. So West Pakistan, because of the violence, essentially we see a type of purge of all non-Muslim minority groups. Of course, there's a couple of, not a couple, but there's like several tens of thousands of Christians who remain, especially of the Dalit community. But essentially what we see is that the western wing of Pakistan essentially is overwhelmingly Muslim majority, and the eastern wing is still very much mixed. So when we talk about the story of blasphemy going away, can't fully go away because there's still a large Hindu population that has remained in Pakistan. But what we see is that it turns. So the violence that was initially articulated against non-Muslims now quells over and reheats the sort of Sunni-Shia dispute that we see bubbling up again in West Pakistan. But the violence is now also targeted against Ahmadis. So people go back and they discover a couple of a couple of essays that have been written by Muhammad Iqbal, the great poet and the great sort of thinker behind the idea of Pakistan, who many believe, together with Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had really created the conceptual foundations of the state. And they discover those essays that he had written very explicitly in order to cast out Ahmadis of counting as Muslims. And Iqbal has been very vehement about it because he believes that if the only thing that is holding Pakistan together is the metaphysical connection that all Muslims have with each other, then any sort of disruption in that sort of higher force would lead to a disintegration of the Muslim community and Pakistan as a state. And he therefore pushed very strongly in the late 1930s to say that as a matter for constitutional law, Ahmadis should not be part of any political community. That doesn't mean that he went out and said that there should be large-scale violence that should be expressed against them or any of that, but essentially that they should not be part of the political community of a Muslim majority nation state. So when we really go into 47, we see that people are rediscovering these ideas and they're trying to enforce them through street protests. So we have a lot of anti-Ahmadi protests that culminate in this 1953 moment where the first state of emergency is declared in Pakistan and the army comes in and essentially takes over the day-to-day running of an entire province.
Wow.
And they do this in order to protect lives, of course, but at the same time, we have this link re-emerging where outrage over blasphemy is leading through to a political transformation of the state.
Now everybody is outraged against Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan in that era, but right now it's just outrage. How does it go from being outrage to being a law? To be if people who are listening, if you don't know, in current Pakistan, if you're an Ahmadi, then you're legally considered non-Muslim, and then you become a target for a lot of oppressive laws and oppressive political tactics. So it's tough being an Ahmadi in Pakistan, really is. Yeah. So going back to the question, how do we go from being an outrage to being law?
Okay, so the first key thing that really takes place is the independence of Bangladesh. So we have an entire wing of the country that is now finding that it's not been treated very nicely by West Pakistan. So East Pakistan feels that they're being discriminated against, and they have good reasons for that feeling, because more people live in the East than do in the West. We have this one big election that takes place. Sheikh Mujib has the most votes and should be sworn in as Prime Minister of Pakistan. And on the other hand, we have a young man, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the founder of the PPP, and he doesn't think that a leader from the East could rule Pakistan. So what he does is refuse to accept this new government. And then we have the violence that unfolds in the East, and eventually the Bengalis declaring a national independence with the help of India. And after that moment, the very key questions that people are asking themselves are re-emerging. So why Pakistan? If it didn't work to hold Muslims together, but led to another partition within a very short time span, is that idea even viable? And in order to re-emphasize that that idea is very viable, we see an increased interest in a specific theological language that is being used by politicians who otherwise identify themselves as very much on the left. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is the person who brings about the constitutional amendment in order to ban Ahmadi. So it doesn't come through, say, Ziaul Haq, the military ruler, who's generally and rightly considered to have nudged Pakistan towards a kind of Shariatic ideal. But it's Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who comes and pushes for the constitutional amendment, the Second Amendment to the Constitution, and declares Ahmadis as non-Muslims, and also that any acts that they do which would be mimicking Muslim behavior are also considered as blasphemous now.
What's the crime? What's the punishment if they act like Muslims?
I mean, the punishment really varies. In the penal code, it goes all the way. Like if you insult the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, can all go all the way to the death sentence. It's also a mandatory death sentence, which was like a sharpening of that rule that the Supreme Court introduced in the early 90s. And to my knowledge, it hasn't been revoked. So I do think it's a mandatory death sentence if it is proven that the insult was directed against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
After him, Zia-ul-Haq takes over and he becomes the leader of Pakistan. What role did he play with Blasphemy?
Zia-ul-Haq are always found to be like a very interesting character within the history of Pakistan. So generally, particularly from the liberal elites and most people who are engaging with academic ideas tend to be somewhat related to that group, English speaking, etc. Has been really seen as like this monstrous figure who sort of hijacks Pakistani politics and transforms it completely. But after reading a lot of his speeches and also tracking how he enters the Pakistani political system, I have to say that Zia-ul-Haq doesn't really bring very many innovations as much as he tries to enforce or tries to hold the country to the laws that he believes have been or hold the country to account to the constitutional ideas that were there in its founding moment. Let's put it like this, right? Mm-hmm. So Zia-ul-Haq doesn't believe that he's bringing like something new, but he does believe that the promise of Pakistan is very much what he's bringing to the country. And Zia-ul-Haq is very much a creation of the colonial India. So he goes to the top institutions. At that time, it's a college called St. Stephen's, still very competitive to enter. It's in Delhi. He studies economics, ranks first in the undergrad tripos, which at the time was not easy, then enters the military and then has a very distinguished sort of military career, and is then promoted to the Chief of Army Staff over the head of other more senior generals by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The reason that he promotes Zia-ul-Haq is because he believes that Zia-ul-Haq can be that he's promoting Zia-ul-Haq over his head, essentially, and therefore he will be very pliable to any demands that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto will have of him. But Zia very quickly develops a head of his own and begins to undermine the political leadership of Bhutto, stages a coup and imprisons Bhutto and sentences him to death for several accusations that keep changing. But essentially, he says that he ordered killing, and he presents more or less witnesses to that account. And Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is then hanged. Once Zulfikar Ali Bhutto is hanged, Zia-ul-Haq goes about of transforming the legal system according to the constitutional conventions that he feels should have been in place right from the beginning, so right from 1947. And he believes that there should be a parallel Shariatic legal structure with Sharia courts where people can go both for their for issues regarding inheritance, divorce, etc., but also for criminal acts. So criminal acts should also be judged according to the so-called hudud ordinances that he introduces. So Islamic punishments in an Islamic country is essentially his credo at the time. And what he also does is starts a very strong new drive in order to exclude Ahmadis from public life. So whereas Bhutto very opportunistically included the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which criminalized specific behaviors that the Ahmadis could do by posing as Muslims. It's really Zia-ul-Haq who enforces all of these rules and who says that now is the time for me to sort of be very strict on that movement. And that's also really the big moment. So the 80s are the big moments where many of the Ahmadis leave Pakistan. I'm not sure how many are still left in the state, probably somewhere between 100 and 200,000 from my calculations, but that's really the big moment where they start leaving Pakistan and settle in other countries because they can no longer hold public offices, and they're excluding from much of the public life in the republic.
After he gets killed in the plane crash, after him, I think, is Benazir Bhutto that takes over the chair. Now she's like, studied in the West, the modern day woman. How does she do? What does she do when she's up there?
Well, Benazir is really the person that a lot of people hope will bring about the sort of change and usher Pakistan into modernity. She studies, as you rightly say, in the US and then later on at Oxford. Returns to Pakistan with really a big vision, but very quickly becomes kind of power politicians, as we have seen her father be for the longest time. So rather than slowing down on the path that Zia-ul-Haq has taken, we see her essentially just continuing with the same politics because she needs the vote bank and she needs the party seats that are held by people who feel very strongly about issues regarding theology, the Ahmadi controversy, and blasphemy against the Prophet, peace be upon him. So we don't really see much change during her reign. And the same is, of course, true for Nawaz Sharif, who then takes over. And then we have this long sort of back and forth. And then the emergence of a party that really takes this old debate as its banner, the Tahrik-e Labbaik Ya Rasulullah, and who surprisingly wins more than 2 million votes in the 2018 elections, and really shifts the entire dynamics of the republic by being able to hold the state hostage by staging big dharnas. And
Currently, Imran Khan, is he a hostage of the politics that he entered, or is he someone who has made some significant change? And is these political parties that you're talking about, especially the one right now that you mentioned, how influential are they now, and how powerful are they?
I mean, it's really difficult to assess their power in this very current moment where everything seems to be in flux, right? Where we had a change in government recently.
True. I mean, just like a few years before that.
In general, they have a lot of street muscle in the sense that they could bring Islamabad, Rawalpindi to a grinding halt, as they have done in the past. And they can assert their pressure both on the army and on parliament. And they've developed a much bigger vote bank than anybody had ever thought possible for outspokenly religious party to gain in a place with such entrenched politics such as Pakistan, where many of the seats are held by the so-called electables. And, it was always thought that it was rather impossible for people or novel parties sort of break into it. So the TLP has managed to do that. Now, Imran Khan's role hasn't really been in one line. So it's kind of difficult to see where he is going to stand on this issue in the future.
What about in the last few years?
In the last few years, he's tried to avoid the issue by sidestepping it. So we had this one appointment of Atif Mia, who's an economist professor over at Princeton University, also, I believe, a convert to the Ahmadiyya movement. And that caused quite a stir when Imran Khan decided to appoint him to his economic steering committee, pretty much unpaid position from what I understand. But there were protests, people threatened to leave his party, and Imran Khan gave in. And the interview I think that he gave at the time was that he didn't know that Atif Mia belonged to that specific group, otherwise he wouldn't have suggested him. Now, one could make of that sentence, one could interpret it in both ways. One is that, well, Imran Khan also believes that there's no place for this group within the higher administration and anything that has to do with sovereign power in the state of Pakistan, even in an advisory capacity. Or it could mean that he's trying to, if he wanted to interpret it in a sort of more positive light, it could mean that, in the future, he foresees that that could change. But for now, he doesn't want to make it an issue, given that he doesn't have an overwhelming majority, or at that point, an overwhelming majority of seats behind him to back him in that. And also, it took quite a bit of time for Imran Khan to actually come out and make a statement. The initial statements were done, I think it was by one of his ministers, Fawad Chaudhry, who actually defended the appointment and said, like, well, that's who we're going to run with, before they made the U-turn. I think it was about a week or 10 days that it took him to sort of turn around. So maybe they were feeling their way into it and see how big of a controversy would really be, and if they could pull through with it. Or maybe they just didn't know, and it took them some time to come around to that. But really, in terms of an alternative, there is no political party, to my knowledge, that has come out in direct support of the Ahmadiyya movement.
Can they? I mean, if they did, wouldn't that mean violence for them and get them killed?
I do feel that the MQM, like the old leader of the MQM, Adeel Hussain, once came very close, but he had a very eccentric style of both delivering his message. Sometimes he would just break into singing songs and, addressing large-scale audiences, mainly from London, where he's in exile. And I think he spoke somewhat sympathetically about this issue, but I do feel no party would go so far as to say that they want to change the constitution in order to exclude to erase the amendment that is banning Ahmadis from being recognized as Muslims. I don't see that. I don't really see that happening.
We're talking a lot about Ahmadis and how they're the targets here, but what about when it comes to other minority sects? Obviously Christianity and Hinduism and Sikhs are all non-Muslims, but there's also a minority sect, Shia. How have they all kind of dealt with this concept of blasphemy in the political legal framework of Pakistan?
All minority groups in Pakistan have had to face the very harsh wind regarding the very strict blasphemy legislation. I guess the most famous case that went all the way to the Supreme Court in Pakistan was the Asia Bibi case, where we had a farmhand, illiterate in the Punjab, who was accused of making accusations against the Prophet. And she was a Christian, also a member of the sort of Dalit Dalit community. A lot of the Dalits converted in the colonial era to Christianity, and in that case, what we have seen is that all minority groups can be and are targeted with blasphemy accusations. And in that sense, even Muslim groups like the Shias of Pakistan have faced increasing accusations of blasphemy in recent years. So we really see like the conversation around blasphemy and the legal debate around blasphemy drawing bigger and bigger circles as time goes on, so much so that it's become really one of the key issues that is being debated in Pakistani law and in Pakistani politics.
We started a conversation with a dispute between a Hindu sect and the Ahmadi Muslims, right? And we went from there to all the way there. It's kind of ironic that it goes full circle, where blasphemy starts against the Hindu sect from the Ahmadi sect, but then it kind of turns on themselves and they become the target. It's full circle, right? That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
that is the thing that's really the irony of history, that the group that was lobbying for all the legal changes regarding blasphemy, that were pushing the colonial administration, writing long letters for anti-blasphemy legislation to be included in the penal code, is the one that is being targeted of blasphemy. So it really comes back full circle.
And another ironic thing is that any leader that promoted blasphemy ended up either being killed or, I guess, exiled.
True.
Which is another ironic thing. And then the next one kind of takes over and same thing happens to them. Except for Imran Khan, but we don't know what's going to happen to him yet. We were talking about blasphemy in the Islamic context, through the Islamic lens. But at the same time, if there was a blasphemy against Islam, there's also an opposing force, which is Hinduism. What about Hindu nationalism and blasphemy in the context of Hinduism, and how did that kind of start from that same dispute that we were talking initially, and where did that go? And or does it even have a factor in Hindu nationalism today?
It's a really interesting development, and I address it in the epilogue of my book a little bit, because whereas the Ahmadiyya group was the one that was sort of kicked out, excluded, and had all of these constitutional dilemmas that eventually led to like their declaration for being non-Muslims, the Arya Samaj retained its influence within an Indian republic. So both in terms of keeping very close ties to the RSS, a sort of paramilitary group that is the ideological force behind the political party BJP, the Bharat Janata Party, that is currently ruling in India, to the early years of the Congress Party too, with leaders like Patel and others, and Mukherjee, who were very outspoken in their sympathies for the Arya Samaj movements. So whereas in Pakistan we see an exclusion of that type of element, in India we see an incorporation. So all the Arya Samaj is like fully incorporated into the leadership structure of the All India Congress Party, and then any splinter parties that emerge from it in the next 70 years. And we also see it with the leader Narendra Modi, who regularly goes and pays his respects to Dayanand Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj movement, and who believes that his mission is really a continuation of the muscular sort of ideas that Dayanand Saraswati represented.
Wow. So my last question, violence and blasphemy is so rooted into Pakistani society now. Do you think that there's hope? Do you think there's ever going to be a time where we can get out of this?
Yes, and the reason that I do believe that there's hope is that there's so many Muslim countries who've managed to deal with very similar issues of rapid transformation, modernity, like whatever key word you want to use here, but who've been able to handle them in a very good manner. So I do believe that Pakistan doesn't have to be the exception here, right? And with the right leadership and with some politician who is willing and able to sort of move the debate in a different direction, that could shift. Does that mean that they will change the constitution regarding specific minority groups and their belonging to the Muslim faith? I don't know. Could happen. It could not happen, right? It's anybody's guess. But in general, it is possible. So I do believe in the possibility of this change. I'm not really sure if it is going to happen within the immediate future, though. It's just become like very, very entrenched issues that a lot of people have staked their political fortunes on. And whenever you have issues such as these, it becomes hard to make any immediate changes.
Right. Is there anything you want to add or you want to mention? Do you want to plug in your second book? If anybody is interested.
So the book on Nehru really looks at the other side of the debate, whereas the Blasphemy book really tries to understand Pakistan's legal and constitutional history regarding the issue of blasphemy. The Nehru book that I wrote with a very dear colleague of mine, Dripudaman Singh, focuses on Jawaharlal Nehru, the leader of the Indian National Congress Party, and the debates that he had regarding the constitutional future of the Indian Republic. Where should it go? And those constitutional debates, interesting enough, are also held with two Muslims, one of them being Muhammad Ali Jinnah, of course. At that point, the president of the Muslim League, that is the party that later gave wind to the Pakistan movement and eventually created the state. And the second one is Muhammad Iqbal, a conversation that is very often forgotten, but nonetheless sort of resurrected in our book on Nehru.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was great.
Cool. I was really trying to have like a more sort of optimistic spin, but I guess it's always hard when your topic is blasphemy.
Yeah, it is hard.
Yeah.
Plus, no one will believe you.
It's just so hard. Like, I really do hope that they get their act together. Particularly, like other Muslim countries seem to be managing.
Like what Muslim country changed their ways?
Well, if you look at a place like Indonesia, they've been fairly good with it. If you look like a place, the UAE has been very good with it. So not every Muslim majority country starts circling around blasphemy in the same way that Pakistan has over the past 70 years, right? Where it becomes this all-consuming topic, where so much energy is sort of poured into, sort of going over it over and over again.
Yeah.
And all of these energies could be used in more productive ways, right? Which again is not to underplay that, blasphemy isn't a real issue. Like, it is a real issue, but at the same time, it shouldn't be an all-consuming issue. It shouldn't be where your central energies for statecraft go. It shouldn't be the reason that every time Pakistan declares a state of emergency, somehow it has to do with the group that is either committing blasphemy or that is trying to prevent blasphemy from happening, right?
Right.
It shouldn't move to other to other topics, like really shift the debate into another direction.
But with Pakistan, with the Pakistan population, there's like a certain kind of default to violence mentality that goes around, where like violence is okay and violence is something that you just do without thinking. I don't know. There's like a scary part of it where it's just like you say something, someone can hurt you. That's what I always felt. Where the difference between other Muslim countries.
Actually, so I mean, if you read colonial archives as much as I unfortunately have of the 1900s, you really see that it actually doesn't happen.
Really?
Very, very, very much. So essentially, Punjabis have always been a very peace-loving people. it's like hard to sort of square it with partition violence, because that's always like this exception where it sort of completely goes from the people who've been reading and celebrating Bulleh Shah and Sikhism, like really syncretic forms of being together, Hindus and Muslims, to really the people who kill their brothers and neighbors to a degree that we've never really seen before. But I wouldn't really say that there's a propensity to violence that I see like in Pakistanis more than I would in any other group. I do believe that the issue of blasphemy in particular arouses people in Pakistan more than it does in other
That's what I mean.
places. But that I do really think comes from the fact, not because they are more open to the idea of violence, but it comes from the conceptual shift that they believe that they are better Muslims if they follow the rule that they have to avenge the killing, right? If it becomes part of your theological DNA, that you say that, well, if I avenge the killing, I'll be a better Muslim. Like that is the fulfillment of my faith. That is the indicator in which I measure my faith. Then you have your answer, right? Then violence just becomes one step in which you can, fulfill like your theological obligation.
So you could say that it's like a lack of religious education that's causing people to do this, because
I wouldn't really even make a normative suggestion, because I'm kind of neutral. So after reading this debate for a really long time and devoting way too much time on the topic of blasphemy than a single individual should in his lifetime, there is weight to the arguments on both sides, right? So there's weight on both sides. The only thing is that it's become all-consuming. So as opposed to other Muslim countries that have managed to shift the conversation to other issues and used those mental energies in order to facilitate progress, what we have in Pakistan is that there's a constant short circuit of the entirety of any other type of debate in order to return to blasphemy, outrage, violence. And that's really the part that I feel should change, because at the end of the day, there's legitimate theological ground on which you can stand in order to say that blasphemy against the Prophet can be a key issue in your religious matrix. So it's not an outrageous position to take.
Wow. That's so fascinating.
I hope we can continue the conversation like in the future, maybe on the Nehru book or on something else.
Yeah, I'm gonna read it and then I'll message you if you're down to, if you have any free time to do this again. And now you know the drill, you know the format, so it shouldn't be that hard anymore.
Super cool. Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay, take care. Peace out.